welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and today we are going to be discussing the cats of Agatha Christie. But first, I have to just plug my imminent tour of the East Coast. It's happening in just a few short days, which means this is the last time you will hear me do this rundown. On Tuesday, March 4th, I'll be at Tickham's Bookshop in Cape Cod in East Sandwich, Massachusetts. The next day, on Wednesday, March 5th, I will be at the fabulous, the iconic, mysterious Bookshop in New York, in lovely Manhattan. The next day, on Thursday, March 6th, I will be in Connecticut at the Avon Free Public Library. Those are all venues I visited last year when my first mystery novel, The Busybody, came out, and I will now be discussing Loose Lips, my second mystery set entirely on a boat at these wonderful venues that I'm revisiting. Those are all evening times. You can click on the link to my website in the show notes if you want further details. And then I am participating in 2 Cozy Cons through my publisher, Kensington Books. So these will be group events with other authors during the day and on the weekends. The first of them is on Saturday, March 8th at the Hunterdon County Library in Flemington, New Jersey. That's taking place from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then the next day, on Sunday, March 9th, I will be at the Enola Fire Company in Enola, Pennsylvania from 1 to 4:30 p.m. I'm looking forward to those Cozy Cons. I think there will be lots of opportunities to hang out and hopefully meet some of you or catch up with some of you who I've already met. So if you're in the area, come out and see me. And if you're not, buy my book anyway. Links are in the show notes. You know the drill at this point. And thank you, as always, for all of the support. It means so much. Okay, it is time for a spoiler warning. The following novels and short stories will be spoiled to varying degrees in this episode: The ABC Murders, Cat Among the Pigeons, The Clocks, The Crackler, The Cretan Bull, The Face of Helen, The Girl in the Train, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, A Murder is Announced, Murder is Easy, Sleeping Murder, and The Strange Case of Sir Arthur Carmichael. You have been warned, and it is now officially time to discuss the cats of Agatha Christie. I have to start by crediting some sources here who helped me in my search for cats in the Christie oeuvre. The Christie and mystery scholar Kate Jackson has a wonderful article all about cats in mystery fiction, which goes back to Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, a short story that first appeared in 1843. Though a word of warning to any cat lovers out there, do not read that short story if you are uncomfortable with violence inflicted upon cats, and perhaps also inflicted by cats. Kate traces the strange role that cats have played in mystery fiction, despite their rather sunny perch in this day and age inside the pages of all those quote-unquote cozy mysteries where cats are beloved pets and sometimes even amateur sleuths. Cats in Golden Age detective fiction tend to be a lot weirder than that, and Christie is no exception. So get excited. I linked to Kate's article in the show notes. I also read an extremely useful article on this blog called Literary Potpourri, which was created by a big book and cat lover. Not an unusual pairing, as I'm sure many of you out there can attest. By the way, I feel like I should be upfront about my relationship to cats before I get any further. I grew up with dogs, never cats, because my dad is actually allergic to cats. So I'm not super comfortable with cats since I didn't grow up with them. And yet I've always had an affection for them from afar, which feels appropriate for the way felines relate to humans. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'd say I am a cat fan, but not a cat lover. I just wanted to put that out there. Anyway, I linked in the show notes to this article that I read on the blog Literary Potpourri, and the article is titled Tracing Cats in Christie. It was posted on International Cat Day in 2020. That's August 8th, in case you didn't know. I actually toyed with the idea of waiting till then to release this episode, but I couldn't wait that long, so here we are. And then I also have to thank Dr. Michelle Kasmer. She cast an eye over an early list that I made when I still thought I was going to do a dog and cat focused episode. But then I realized I had such an embarrassment of riches that I was going to have to divide them up. And that's really the more natural way to do this anyway, right? So thank you, Michelle. I hasten to add that all errors and omissions are mine, as they always are. And of course, I want you to tell me all about them so that I can feature your corrections and additions and anything else on my next episode for this podcast, which I'll tell you now is going to be a mailbag only episode. I have so many great messages to share with you that I decided to devote an entire episode to them. But there's always room for more, and I'd love to add some cat-themed messages to the pile before I release that episode, so don't be shy. Keep those messages coming. And now, before I get started on my top 10 list of the cats in Christie, as a blanket statement, I will say this. It's pretty obvious that Christie was more of a dog person than a cat person because there is a lot more doggy content in the oeuvre. That is undeniable. As far as I know, she never wrote from a cat's point of view, as she did with dogs in Dumb Witness and Postern of Fate. And whenever cats do appear in her fiction, it's a bit less effusive, a bit more utilitarian than she tends to be with her dog creations. Christie's heart lies in the canine kingdom, I think, but let's not dwell on this disparity because we are here today to celebrate the cats in Agatha Christie's work. And it turns out that there is quite a bit to celebrate. I really didn't think when I started putting together this list that I would be able to cobble together 10 cat entries. But then once I put my mind to it, I, of course, assembled way more than 10, which means I have some honorable mentions as well. All right, let's get started with our 10th entry. Here we have the cat from the short story, The Cretan Bull, from the Labors of Hercules collection. And this poor unnamed cat is essentially collateral damage, which is a bit of a theme, I'm afraid. It's going to come up a few times on this list. And again, I think this conveys Christie's relative lack of affection for cats as compared to dogs. She is more than willing to kill a cat for purposes of the plot, listeners. A darling doggy? Not so much. I have to admit, I didn't even remember this cat myself. It's referenced so glancingly in the story, but Kate Jackson mentioned it in her excellent article, so here we are. In The Cretan Bull, we learn that Hugh Chandler, who may or may not be insane, is said to have cut the throat of a nameless cat, which is an indication that he is not doing so well. Of course, in the end, we learn that Hugh's father is the one who was doing all this and who was not doing very well, and also that he's not actually Hugh's biological father. So all ends up okay for Hugh and his lady love, Diana, but not that poor cat. All right, in our 9th spot, we have our first named cat, and this is from the very last mystery novel of Christie's to be published, Sleeping Murder. So one of the memories that comes back to Gwenda Reed once she realizes that she used to live at Hillside, back when it was named St. Catherine's, is of the housemaid Lily putting a bow on their black and white house cat. And it's the former cook, Edith Paget, who supplies the cat's name. It's Thomas. And Thomas didn't like when Lily took a bow from the chocolate box that must have been one of Gwenda's presents, because this happened on her birthday, which also explains why she retained the memory. And here's what Edith says. Thomas was mad about it, ran off into the garden and rubbed through the bushes until he got it off. Cats don't like tricks being played on them. Poor old Tommy, caught mice something beautiful, a real proper mouser. And I want you all to remember that detail about a cat who catches mice beautifully, because it's going to come up again. And then a little later in the novel, we get a further reminiscence from Gwenda when she's talking to her husband, Giles. I remember Tommy, too. He was black with white patches, and he had 3 lovely kittens. And then Giles asks, what? Thomas? And Gwenda replies, well, he was called Thomas, but actually, he turned out to be Thomasina. You know what cats are. I feel like Gwenda should have said, you know what humans are? The mistake lies with Thomas/Thomasina's owners, not with the cat. Poor Tommy. I hope the 3 kittens were a consolation. And now let's just move right on to number 8, because believe it or not, we are going to stay on this theme of not realizing a cat is female until she has kittens. In The Girl in the Train, not to be confused with The Girl on the Train, we open on the charming cad, George Roland, who's gotten fired from his office job by his uncle for coming in severely hungover. We get the sense this isn't the first time George has done this, and even though he's very likable, the older I get, the more I find my sympathies lying with the boring uncles of the world. Just rewatch Reality Bites and see what you think of Ethan Hawke. I dare you. Anyway, George decides on a whim to go on a day trip since he doesn't have a job anymore, and he uses an ABC railway guide in a much sunnier manner than we've come to expect from a character in a Christie story. And he lands on the destination of Roland's Castle, which he decides to go to for the lark of being able to pretend he's returning to his ancient family manor. He says, "These quiet little country hamlets have a lot of the old feudal spirit knocking about. The last of the original Rolands ought to meet with instant appreciation. I shouldn't wonder if they elected me mayor in a week." And as part of this impromptu plan, he asks something of Rogers, who is the Jeeves-like butler at his uncle's mansion, because of course the Bertie Wooster, like George, lives off his uncle's largesse. George asks Rogers if the cook will, quote, "oblige me with the loan of the cat. Dick Whittington, you know, when you set out to become a Lord Mayor, a cat is essential." Okay, so I will admit this reference went over my head the first time I read the story. I think this is one of those instances in Christie where it's helpful to be British, because I have a feeling Dick Whittington is still a more familiar reference for British people than it is for others. Richard Whittington is a real person who actually did become the Lord Mayor of London, but there's an apocryphal version of his story. It's this rags to riches folktale that's traditionally told in pantomime around Christmas, and which has also been retold in children's picture books and whatnot, and that's what George is referencing here. Part of the folktale of Dick Whittington is that he started out very poor, and one of the ways he found his footing was through this cat of his, which was very good at killing rats. This is not the reference to a cat killing mice that we are waiting for, by the way. That is yet to come. So there are different versions of this story, but it seems that Dick is able to make his fortune off the sale of the cat to a rat-infested country in dire need of this cat's services. So this is really a tale about the usefulness of cats, and because of it, the idea of becoming the mayor of Roland's Castle must include a cat for our glib, sardonic George Roland. And here's the delightful exchange between him and the butler, Rogers, once he's asked for the cook's cat. "I'm sorry, sir, but the cat is not available at the present moment." "How is that?" "A family of 8, sir, arrived this morning." "You don't say so. I thought its name was Peter." "So it is, sir. A great surprise to all of us." "A case of careless christening in the deceitful sex, eh? Well, well, I shall have to go catless." Love it. Poor Peter, 8 kittens. Oof. I also love that so far we have 2 humdrum names for cats in Thomas and Peter. If cat names in Christie are anything like dog names, we should also get a few over-the-top regal ones and then some cutesy, somewhat demeaning ones as well. We shall see. All right, in 7th place, we have the cat from the Quinn Satterthwaite short story, The Face of Helen. As in The Cretan Bull, here too, we have a nameless cat who functions as collateral damage. I told you we were going to see this again. But at least the manner in which this poor cat meets its demise is much more interesting. The beautiful Gillian West, who has the titular Face of Helen, has been gifted a wireless, aka a radio, and this strange but beautiful glass beaker with a big glass bubble at the end of it. It's a gift from a friend of hers who is clearly in love with her, but he seems to have taken it super well that she's fallen in love with another man and become engaged to this other man. All the friend asks is that she sit alone at home on a certain evening, which is the anniversary of the day they first met, and that she listen to the wireless. It takes Mr. Satterthwaite kind of a long time to get there, but what he realizes eventually is that there's an opera singer scheduled to sing on the wireless who hits a note high enough to shatter glass, which means if there is a deadly poison gas inside that glass bubble, it will leak out when the bubble shatters and the poison gas will kill Gillian. This is definitely one of the more outlandish murder schemes in all of Christie. It's so outlandish that I think she felt the need to insert a sacrificial lamb into the proceedings to prove that it actually would have worked, or a sacrificial cat, as it were. So Mr. Satterthwaite breaks in upon Gillian and he saves her at the very last moment, whisking her out of the flat. And at that point, a stray cat darts past them and goes inside. And we learn later that this poor kitty did die. But by story's end, so too has the attempted murderer. So I suppose in a way, the cat was avenged. All right, number 6 is actually one of my favorite entries on this list, even though the novel featured here is by no means my favorite Christie novel. It is time to talk about The Clocks, in which Christie uses cats for comedic effect. This is quite an unusual use of cats in Christie. So we have this long section in The Clocks where 2 investigators go around Wilbraham Crescent in the aftermath of finding a dead body at number 19, and they're inquiring of the neighbors whether they saw or know anything. These investigators are Inspector Hardcastle and Colin Lamb, who is not explicitly identified in the book as such, but who we know from comments that Christie made elsewhere is definitely the son of Superintendent Battle. So, mea culpa here, but in my last episode all about love in Christie, I misspoke and I said Superintendent Spence when I was talking about Superintendent Battle's 2 children, Sylvia, who we get a glimpse of in Toward Zero, and Colin Lamb here in The Clocks. I actually went into the episode and corrected my error, which I don't usually bother to do, but this one was annoying enough to me that I had to do it. It was just one of those classic cases where my brain knew what I meant. Of course, I knew that I was talking about Superintendent Battle, but my mouth just said the wrong thing. Very, very frustrating. Anyway, when Colin Lamb and Inspector Hardcastle get to number 20, Wilbraham Crescent, the pretentiously named Diana Lodge, they meet Mrs. Hemming and her many, many, many cats. I'm just going to quote now from the text because I won't do it justice if I try to describe this scene. Hardcastle and Lamb are still at the door here, and they are listening to someone who is approaching. No, sweet sweetie, in there, my love. Mindums, Talums, Shasha Mimi, Cleo, Cleopatra, Adidudums, Alulu. Doors were heard to shut. Finally, the front door opened. Facing them was a lady in a pale, moss-green, rather rubbed, velvet tea gown. Her hair, in flaxen gray wisps, was twirled elaborately in a kind of coiffure of some 30 years back. Round her neck she was wearing a necklet of orange fur. Inspector Hardcastle said dubiously, Mrs. Hemming? I am Mrs. Hemming. Gently, Sunbeam, gently, Doodlums. It was then that the inspector perceived that the orange fur was really a cat. It was not the only cat. 3 other cats appeared along the hall, 2 of them meowing. They took up their place, gazing at the visitors, twirling gently round their mistress's skirts. At the same time, a pervading smell of cat afflicted the nostrils of both men. I am Detective Inspector Hardcastle. I hope you've come about that dreadful man who came to see me from the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, said Mrs. Hemming. Disgraceful. I wrote and reported him, saying my cats were kept in a condition prejudicial to their health and happiness. Quite disgraceful. I live for my cats, Inspector. They are my only joy and pleasure in life. Everything is done for them. Shasha Mimi, not there, sweetie. Shasha Mimi paid no attention to a restraining hand and jumped on the hall table. He sat down and washed his face, staring at the strangers. Come in, said Mrs. Hemming. Oh no, not that room. I'd forgotten. She pushed open a door on the left. The atmosphere here was even more pungent. Come on, my pretties, come on. In the room, various brushes and combs with cat hairs in them lay about on chairs and tables. There were faded and soiled cushions, and there were at least 6 more cats. I live for my darlings, said Mrs. Hemming. They understand every word I say to them. Inspector Hardcastle walked in manfully. Unfortunately for him, he was one of those men who have cat allergy. As usually happens on these occasions, all the cats immediately made for him. One jumped on his knee, another rubbed affectionately against his trousers. Detective Inspector Hardcastle, who was a brave man, set his lips and endured. I wonder if I could ask you a few questions, Mrs. Hemming, about anything you please, said Mrs. Hemming, interrupting him. I have nothing to hide. I can show you the cats' food, their beds where they sleep, 5 in my room, the other 7 down here. They have only the very best fish cooked by myself. "This has nothing to do with cats," said Hardcastle, raising his voice. "I came to talk to you about the unfortunate affair which happened next door. You have probably heard about it." "Next door? You mean Mr. Joshua's dog?" "No," said Hardcastle, "I do not. I mean at number 19, where a man was found murdered yesterday." "Indeed?" said Mrs. Hemming, with polite interest but no more. Her eyes were still straying over her pets. So that is 12 cats by Mrs. Hemming's reckoning, though it's an open question that I believe gets pondered later on in the novel, whether she has many, many more, and I'm pretty sure she does. After this, Mrs. Hemming explains how one of her cats, Arabella, was up a tree and she was trying to tempt the cat down with a saucer of fish. And it wasn't until she gave up and walked back in the house that the cat came down the tree and followed her inside. At which point we get a pronouncement on the curious, contrarian nature of cats from Colin Lamb, the way that they reject frank affection and respond lovingly to being ignored. He says this as a cat lover, I should add, and I'll quote from him now. "I am much attached to cats, and I have therefore made a study of cat nature. What you have told me illustrates perfectly the pattern of cat behavior and the rules they have made for themselves. In the same way, your cats are all congregating round my friend, who frankly does not care for cats. They will pay no attention to me in spite of all my blandishments." There's also a great detail where Mrs. Hemming replaces the orange cat around her neck with a gray Persian cat. I mean, the woman is almost literally swimming in cats. Though to be fair to these cats, when Colin Lamb strokes a different gray Persian, not the one wrapped around Mrs. Hemming's neck, and tickles it behind its ears, the gray cat condescended to purr. So occasionally cats do respond to affection, as all cat lovers know. This is all just very funny, and one of my favorite things about the clocks is that Mrs. Hemming, who really couldn't care less about the murder that's taken place next door, so much so that Hardcastle and Lamb find it suspicious, she turns out to have nothing to do with anything. And I mean, thank goodness, right? Just leave her and her cats in peace. Or maybe separate her from her cats and find a better home for them. Either way. And here's just a rundown of the names of the cats that we get in this scene. Shasha Mimi, Sunbeam, Cleopatra, and Arabella. None of those is of the humdrum variety. I'd say that Shasha Mimi and Sunbeam fall into the cutesy/ridiculous category, and Cleopatra and Arabella into the over-the-top regal category. So that's number 6. Moving on now to our top half of the list. We also have a big mass of cats in our 5th entry, just as we do in the clocks, but none of these cats are named, and much to Mrs. Hemming's horror, I have to imagine, all these cats are strays. They are the cats that appear in the Tommy and Tuppence short story, The Crackler. And in this case, they are not used for comedic purposes. The cats are the ones to save the day. So basically, in this short story within the Partners in Crime collection, our resourceful Tommy Beresford knows that he's being whisked away by the bad guy who's pretending to be a good guy. This is Mr. Ryder. And Tommy is pretending not to know any better so that Mr. Ryder will show him his counterfeiting headquarters in Whitechapel, which are accessed via an alleyway. And here is how Christie describes that alleyway. On the left were the backs of a row of dilapidated houses, most of which had doors opening into the alley. So when Mr. Ryder points out the door in question, Tommy notes that they all look the same. And he makes a big show of marking the door with a piece of white chalk that he has in his pocket. He makes a cross low down on the door. And then we get this curious moment. He looked up at various dim shapes that prowled high on the walls of the alley, one of which was uttering a blood-curdling yowl. "Lots of cats about," he remarked cheerfully. Okay. Ryder takes Tommy inside and subsequently reveals that he is the criminal mastermind running things, and that in the interim, a little white cross has been put on every door in the alley. Which means that even if Tommy somehow alerted someone to the general area where he was headed, they will never find him, and all is lost. But wait, just then Inspector Marriott and the faithful Albert come bursting in to the rescue. How did they know where Tommy was? Well, let's let Tommy explain, shall we? This is him talking to Ryder, our baddie. Whilst I was ostentatiously marking a chalk cross on the door to engage your attention, I also emptied a little bottle of valerian on the ground. Nasty smell, but cats love it. All the cats in the neighborhood were assembled outside to mark the right house when Albert and the police arrived. So, cat lovers might be interested to know that apparently 1/3 of all cats do not feel the effect of catnip, which is itself a natural plant, just like valerian. So, valerian is one of the alternatives that cat owners can use if catnip doesn't work. I feel pretty strongly that Christie saw a bunch of alley cats crowding around something one day and had the idea of using them in one of her mysteries. I don't really think this is one of her most ingenious or airtight plots, however. We are told that Albert was instructed to follow Tommy if he ever went off with Mr. Ryder. So if Tommy knew that Ryder was the baddie, why didn't he just have Inspector Marriott or one of Marriott's juniors follow as well for full manpower? Why was it only Albert? I mean, I guess the idea is that Albert followed Tommy and then he left the area to go get Marriott, seemingly planning to rely on the White Cross to remember where Tommy was. And since the White Cross trick was foiled, as Tommy expected it to be, Inspector Marriott then needed the cats to know precisely where Tommy was. I mean, wouldn't Albert kinda, sorta have been able to remember? How big exactly is this alley? I guess it's more believable in a cell phone-free age, obviously, but it's still a little clumsy. Even so, hooray for the cats, right? Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Okay, so my fourth entry on this list is sourced from an A+++ listener. She knows who she is, who, when she found out that I was doing a cat-themed episode, got in touch with me to make sure that I did not forget this cat in particular. And I am so glad that she did, because I absolutely would have forgotten this cat. So who is this fabulous feline? It is the quote-unquote professional cat featured in Christie's oh-so-breezy autobiographical work, Come Tell Me How You Live. Now, this is the only real cat we have on the entire list. We had lots of real dogs when we were talking about the dogs of Agatha Christie, but this is the only instance that I have of Christie going on at length about a cat of her own acquaintance. And this is going to require a little bit of setup, but I think it's worth it. So here goes. I'm just going to read out from the text now. Christie is talking about arriving at a new dig in the Middle East because, of course, Come Tell Me How You Live is all about her adventures in the Middle East with her second husband, Max Mallowan. And this is how their first night at Amuda went. No sooner have the lamps been extinguished than mice in their scores, I really believe in their hundreds, emerge from the holes in the walls and the floor. They run gaily over our beds, squeaking as they run. Mice across one's face, mice tweaking your hair, mice, mice, mice! I switch on a torch. Horrible! The walls are covered with strange, pale, crawling cockroach-like creatures. A mouse is sitting on the foot of my bed, attending to his whiskers. Horrible, crawling things are everywhere. Max utters soothing sounds. Just go to sleep, he says. Once you are asleep, none of these things will worry you. Excellent advice, but not easy to act upon. One has first to get to sleep, and with mice taking healthy exercise and having their field sports all over you, that is hardly possible. Or it is not possible for me. Max seems able to do it all right. I endeavor to subdue the shrinkings of the flesh. I do fall asleep for a short spell, but little feet running across my face wake me up. I flash on the light. The cockroaches have increased, and a large black spider is descending upon me from the ceiling. So the night goes on, and I am ashamed to say that at 2 a.m., I become hysterical. When morning comes, I declare I am going into Kamichli to wait for the train, and I am going straight back to Aleppo. And from Aleppo, I shall go straight back to England. I cannot stand this life. I will not stand it. I am going home. In a masterly fashion, Max deals with the situation. He rises, opens the door, calls to Hamoudi, who is one of their many helpers. 5 minutes later, our beds have been dragged out into the courtyard. For a short while, I lie gazing up at the peaceful starlit sky above. The air is cool and sweet. I fall asleep. Max, I rather fancy, breathes a sigh of relief before falling asleep himself. You aren't really going back to Aleppo, Max inquires anxiously the next morning. I blush a little over the remembrance of my hysterical outburst. No, I say, I wouldn't really go for the world, but I am going to continue to sleep in the courtyard. Hamoudi explains soothingly that all will soon be well. The holes in the bedroom are being stopped up with plaster. More whitewash will be applied. Moreover, a cat is coming. It has been loaned out. It is a super cat, a highly professional cat. And then just skipping over a few lines to the next section. Our cat arrives at dinner time. I shall never forget that cat. It is, as Hamoudi has announced, a highly professional cat. It knows the job for which it has been engaged and proceeds to get on with it in a truly specialized manner. Whilst we dine, it crouches in ambush behind a packing case. When we talk or move or make too much noise, it gives us an impatient look. I must request of you, the look says, to be quiet. How can I get on with the job without cooperation? So fierce is the cat's expression that we obey at once, speak in whispers, and eat with as little clinking of plates and glasses as possible. 5 times during the meal, a mouse emerges and runs across the floor, and 5 times our cat springs. The sequel is immediate. There is no Western dallying, no playing with the victim. The cat simply bites off the mouse's head, crunches it up, and proceeds to the rest of the body. It is rather horrible and completely businesslike. The cat stays with us 5 days. After those 5 days, no mice appear. The cat then leaves us, and the mice never come back. I have never known before or since such a professional cat. It had no interest in us. It never demanded milk or a share of our food. It was cold, scientific, and impersonal. A very accomplished cat. How great is that? God, Agatha Christie is such a charming writer when she is writing in that mode. And even though Come Tell Me How You Live is a little too surface for me, it's like a more extreme version of her full autobiography in that way. It still features some shockingly charming prose, which I think was very much on display there. Also, I guess she kind of did write in the voice of a cat, right? Because she sort of does it in this passage, but it's a lot more refined than the doggy language we get in Dumb Witness and Postern of Fate. And I think the cat lovers among us would say that that is appropriate. I completely remember that description of the bugs and the mice on the walls, and I do not blame her for insisting on exiting that room. It reminds me of that scene in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which I watched early enough to have imprinted on my brain. But that scene when they're going through the dark hallway and they hear the bugs and then they shine a light and you see all these big bugs crawling up their legs and on their hands and arms and blah. I actually love insects. I'm not the kind of person to be creeped out by them whatsoever, but that description takes me back to that movie. So that is obviously just a wonderful depiction of a cat. It also reminds me of the way that she describes the maids and cooks and other members of the help at Ashfield when she was a child, how they were specialists, they were experts in what they did, and how interesting she found that and how much respect she had for that. She seems to have the same sort of regard for this professional cat. I really love that. And thank you again, listener, for making sure that I did not neglect to include the professional cat on the list. And how fitting that it doesn't have a name, right? Because I feel like one of those silly names would be so beneath that cat. All right, it is time for our medal winners. Let's start with our bronze medalist in 3rd place. This is a cat that is featured in Murder is Easy, and I'll bet many of you have been waiting for me to talk about Wonky Poo. who we know is male and orange in color. I talked a little bit about poor Wonky Poo in my love episode, and he has come up a bunch before that as well. This is certainly one of the more ridiculous, cutesy names we have for a cat. Christie just can't help herself every now and then. It reminds me of all those demeaning Pekingese names we got in The Nemean Lion. And of course, also Mrs. Hemming's cats in The Clocks. But unlike Mrs. Hemming, Lavinia Pinkerton is a good cat owner. I feel that deeply. Wonky Poo is Miss Pinkerton's cat, and he is practically the first thing that she mentions to Luke Fitzwilliam when she meets him on the train at the start of the book, because she's explaining to Luke why she didn't catch the earlier train. She says, "I meant to go up this morning, but Wonky Poo was missing. That's my cat, Persian. Such a beauty, only he's had a painful ear lately, and of course I couldn't leave home till he was found." I mean, that's devotion for you. She clearly loves her Wonky Poo. And it pains me that the woman who Lavinia knew was up to no good ended up taking Wonky Poo in and then using the poor cat for purposes of more murder. Wonky Poo's infected ear gets remarked on a number of times in the story, and we learn by the end of the book that Honoria Wainfleet used the pus from Wonky Poo's ear as a means of infecting a cut of poor Dr. Humblebee's. She applied a dressing to the cut that had infected cat pus on it. Gross, gross, gross. At least by the end of the novel, Honoria has been found out and taken away, but I'm sad to say that we are not told where Wonky Poo goes next. I hope somewhere nice. I hope that he found a good home. He's really been through the ringer. Poor kitty. Okay, our silver medalist is probably the cat you thought of when you read the title of this episode. And that is Tiglath-Pileser from A Murder is Announced. Am I right? This is obviously one of our over-the-top regal names. Tiglath-Pileser is the cat of Julian and Diana Bunch Harmon, the vicar of Chipping Cleghorn and his wife. And I'll just remind you that we have decided as a community that Bunch Harmon is the daughter of the fornication-hating Caleb Dane Calthrop and his eccentric wife, Maud. Julian is a big history buff, and so he's named the cat after an Assyrian king. Tiglath-Pileser also makes a cameo in the Miss Marple short story Sanctuary, which also features the Harmons. Pretty much whenever we get the Harmons, we get Tiglath-Pileser, and that makes sense because he's their cat. Bunch mentions his finicky stomach in that short story. But do we think that Agatha Christie is gently mocking Max Mallowan here with Julian Harmon, the erudite, antiquities-obsessed Julian Harmon? I think she might be. But it's very affectionate. The Harmons are lovely. Miss Marple is staying with them while the case at Little Paddocks unspools. And when Tiglath-Pileser claws Bunch's arm, lovingly, of course, as any cat owner will tell you, cats only ever claw with love, he causes her to spill water out of the vase that she's holding. And that water spills onto the frayed flex, i.e. the frayed wire of the reading lamp that Bunch has just very thoughtfully put beside Miss Marple so that she can see her knitting better. The water on the frayed wire ends up shorting out all the lights in the room and making a little burn on the table. And then Miss Marple starts talking about seeing something that she ought to have seen before. I'll note that in the Joan Hickson adaptation, the cat gets a gender swap a la Sleeping Murder and The Girl in the Train from male to female, and a name change to go with it. Tiglath-Pileser becomes Delilah. But there's an even greater change in the Geraldine McEwen adaptation. In that one, there is no cat at all, and no Harmons. It's Miss Marple herself who figures out the whole thing with the cord and the water without help from a cat or anyone else. So I suppose that makes her the cat for the film, which isn't entirely inappropriate. I'll get there, actually, in my honorable mentions. But first, it is time for our gold medalist. And believe it or not, our top cat doesn't actually have a name. This is the cat from the short story The Strange Case of Sir Arthur Carmichael, which I referenced in my last episode, All About Love, just as a little teaser, because even though this cat is unnamed, for once we have a story centered around a cat. And I do think, actually, that this story absolutely shares DNA with that 1843 Edgar Allan Poe short story, because here, too, we have a cat who is badly mistreated and who very much gets its revenge. So I'm not going to belabor my plot summary here because you should really just read the story for yourself if you haven't yet. The story was first collected in that oddball collection, The Hound of Death, in 1933. It definitely fits the spooky, supernaturally tinged tone of the majority of those stories. And I'll just mention that Catherine Brobeck and I covered The Strange Case of Sir Arthur Carmichael on Patreon a number of years back. So, in a nutshell, we have a shrink who is our first person narrator, a Dr. Carstairs, and he is called in to investigate some strange goings on at an estate that one of his colleagues thinks might be haunted. It seems that the young and up until the day before, perfectly fit and healthy Sir Arthur Carmichael is acting very strangely. And so is everyone else in the house, at least whenever Dr. Carstairs mentions the beautiful gray Persian cat that he saw on the front lawn as he was driving up to the house. More on this in a moment. First, let's talk about the strange behavior of Sir Arthur Carmichael, who Carstairs observes. Sir Arthur is very still when he sits, and he hunches over and blinks a lot, watching everyone in the room very closely, but never moving. Oh, and the only thing he'll drink since yesterday morning is milk. Here is what Carstairs observes. In a moment or two, without undue haste, Sir Arthur uncoiled himself limb by limb from his huddled position and walked slowly over to the table. I recognized suddenly that his movements were absolutely silent. His feet made no sound as they trod. Just as he reached the table, he gave a tremendous stretch, poised on one leg forward, the other stretching out behind him. He prolonged this exercise to its utmost extent and then yawned. Never have I seen such a yawn. It seemed to swallow up his entire face. He now turned his attention to the milk, bending down to the table until his lips touched the fluid. Settle, which is the name of the other doctor, answered my inquiring look. Won't make use of his hands at all. Seems to have returned to a primitive state. Odd, isn't it? Whenever I read this story, I so badly want some plain-spoken character to just inject themselves into the proceedings so that rather than everyone being very scared and sad and quiet, someone can just be like, clearly that dude is a cat now? Because it's so obvious. At another point in the story, Sir Arthur rubs his head against someone's shoulder, and then later he runs after a mouse, his quivering body swift as an arrow. I mean, come on. The guy's a cat. Anyway, we learn more about the family. Young Sir Arthur is engaged, and his fiancée is staying at the house, and she is totally horrified by what's happened to Arthur. There is also a stepmother in the picture. Lady Carmichael is the widow to Arthur's father, the late Sir William Carmichael, and she had an 8-year-old son with Sir William, and she is very devoted to her young son. So right away, any seasoned mystery reader is going to realize that Lady Carmichael has a vested interest in Sir Arthur dying or being disinherited, since her son would then become the heir. I also do have to acknowledge that the depiction of Lady Carmichael is problematic. It's at the very least stuck in its time. She's described as having quote unquote Oriental blood, and for this reason as being untrustworthy. All right, so I said I wouldn't belabor the plot. Carstairs continues to see and hear a cat on the premises who we come to realize is definitely a ghost cat. We learn that there used to be a cat on the premises which belonged to Lady Carmichael, but that she destroyed it herself. Destroyed is the word that is used, even though now she's claiming that she never had a cat. All this culminates in Lady Carmichael being attacked one night and nearly killed by what seems to be this ghostly cat presence. She's all scratched up and essentially gouged. It's this very bloody scene, but she does not die. And then there's another incident. Sir Arthur, who used to be an excellent swimmer, he's very athletic, he falls into the lake at the estate and he seems to drown. Can we think of another type of creature that hates to go into the water? He is fished out, and eventually he comes round, at which point he's back to his normal self. And when Lady Carmichael sees this, that is when she dies from the shock of seeing Sir Arthur back to his normal self. Because as everyone has figured out by now, Lady Carmichael performed some sort of a magic spell using a book in the library by which she managed to put Arthur's soul into her cat and the cat's soul into Arthur, and then she killed her cat, effectively killing Arthur without having to actually kill Arthur and pay the price for it, and thereby paving the way for her son to inherit the title. Because I suppose poor cat Arthur would eventually have to be committed and wouldn't be able to hold the title. Just so you know, I skipped over a cat exhumation scene, so you're welcome. But as I did in The Crackler, let's just take a moment to parse this out. Lady Carmichael switches the man and cat souls. Okay, fine. Then the cat dies, which means that the man's soul is gone, right? But presumably he's so in love with his fiancée that his soul doesn't depart and instead haunts the house in the guise of a cat, since that's the body in which he died. We are at least told that this ghost cat likes the fiancé character, so I suppose that sort of makes sense. But then Sir Arthur has no recollection of any of this when he returns to his own body. I guess that's just the way it works, but it feels like Christie creates two cat personae here, the cat in Arthur's body and then the ghost cat, rather than just one cat. I mean, I feel like now that Arthur has been restored to his body, that would be the perfect time for the ghost cat to come into its own. But I suppose it's satisfied now that Lady Carmichael is dead, so now it's free to go on to cat heaven or what have you. This story is a bit convoluted, it's a bit ridiculous, but it's also pretty creepy and effective, and it's an excellent cat story. It's not much of a stretch to imagine a cat haunting a house as a ghost. And yet that is not something that I think we come across all that often. And I appreciate that Christie tried it here, and to a large extent pulled it off. For instance, I always really appreciated the touch in the movie Ghost, the Patrick Swayze Demi Moore movie, where we learn that cats can see the dead people walking around, because that just makes perfect sense. I mean, cats are so weird. I totally believe that they can see ghosts. And I say that with love. I would also just like to point out, now that we've gone through our top 10 cats, that 3 of the cats in our top 10 are quote unquote collateral damage. And yet in all 3 cases, the depraved souls who killed these cats are dead by story's end. All 3 of them. I say that as a little consolation for the cat lovers out there, and as proof that Christie did have respect and perhaps even affection for these cats. My last comment on The Strange Case of Sir Arthur Carmichael, the date given in the story for when this cat-human body swap occurred is August 9th, just one day after International Cat Day. Coincidence? Most definitely. All right. We have already spent a lot of time talking about cats, listeners, but I do have some honorable mentions to go through. I'll try to run through these fairly quickly, but I think there are some interesting items in here. According to Dr. Michelle Kasmer, there is a cat puppet in the short story The Dream, and then a cat phone cover in the short story The Adventure of the Cheap Flat. Okay, Michelle. I mean, that's because Michelle's brain is a database, and when I asked her about cats in Christie, she did a search for the word cat in her Christie Mind Palace, and she came right back with those 2 obscure references. I salute you, Michelle, and I just had to share that with all of you. I will note that I didn't really get into cat burglars in Christie because there are a lot of them and they don't really have anything to do with cats. But just in case any of you were wondering, the thought did cross my mind to include cat burglars. I have to mention that The Cat It Was Who Died is one of Ariadne Oliver's books mentioned in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. I feel like Christie is sending up the mystery genre's obsession with cats there for sure. In the short story, How Does Your Garden Grow?, Monsieur Poirot and Miss Lemon meet up in a tea room named The Green Cat. I feel like if I ever do an episode on the pubs of Christie, which I definitely will at some point, I need to do a corollary list of cafes and tea rooms. That's only fair. We also have the Ginger Cat, which gets used as a tea room name twice. Once in Bexhill-on-Sea in the ABC Murders. It's where poor Betty Barnard worked. And then in Dilmouth in Sleeping Murder. Christie just clearly liked the name, the Ginger Cat. It's a good name for a tea room. Also, maybe this and that male cat really being a female cat thing are minor pieces of evidence that Sleeping Murder really was written more on the earlier side. Just a thought. We have a cat to thank, at least partially, for Cherry Baker moving in with Miss Marple. We learn in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side that the baker's neighbor in the development in St. Mary Mead, who Cherry describes as a sour-faced old cat, has an actual cat that gets into their garden and digs up their garden beds. No wonder they moved in with Miss Marple. And then it's not canon, but in the Agatha Christie's Poirot adaptation of The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb, Poirot gifts Miss Lemon with a little cat statue that he says is the very likeness of the favorite cat of King Menher-Ra, which was buried with this pharaoh in his lavish tomb. Because you see, Miss Lemon has lost her cat, Catherine the Great, and that's great Grate, because the cat liked sleeping in the fireplace. And this is what Poirot very sweetly suggests she should do with this cat statue.
Go to bed this evening with him in your hand, and Catherine the Great will visit you during the night.
Oh, Mr. Poirot, thank you.
Such a mensch, that Poirot. We, of course, have lots of cat lovers in Christie, since this is often used as a detail of someone's character. For instance, poor Mrs. McGinty in Mrs. McGinty's Dead was very fond of her cat. I am not going to list all the cat lovers now, but I just wanted to point that out. And I would also like to point out one character in the canon who I feel like is perhaps less of a cat lover than expected, and that is Miss Jane Marple herself. She clearly has a general regard for cats. It's not like she's a cat hater or anything. But isn't Miss Marple exactly the kind of person to own a cat? I mean, she is a Lavinia Pinkerton type. She's obviously much smarter than Lavinia Pinkerton and pretty much everyone else, but she doesn't have a cat. It's a little curious when you think about it, and I'm not sure that I have a good reason why, other than perhaps Christie didn't want to be saddled with a cat companion for any length of time, knowing that she was going to return to Miss Marple as often as she did. I'm not really convinced by my explanation, so I'm curious if anyone out there has any thoughts on the matter. Please let me know. And then finally, we have lots of people who are themselves compared to cats in Christie. I couldn't do this episode without mentioning Cat Among the Pigeons, since the cat comparison is right there in the title. Anne Shapland, the secretary to Miss Bulstrode, definitely lets her claws come out when she is unmasked as the primary killer in that book. So she is the proverbial cat among the pigeons at Meadowbank School. And I should probably also mention the mousetrap, right? Because the murderer in that play is the cat who toys with the three blind mice, right? That is as far as I will go, since I am never going to divulge who done it in the mousetrap. Moving on. Brenda Leonidas in Crooked House is often compared to a cat. And there are lots of others, such as Jackson in A Caribbean Mystery, who is referred to as a tomcat. I like that one because it's a rare use of cat imagery to describe a strong and virile man. A little similarly, the valet Horbury creeps around in Hercule Poirot's Christmas like a cat. And then on the other end, we have Colonel Ned Berry in Dead Man's Mirror, who is described as a tame cat. But he also follows Vanda around like a dog, so I suppose he's a wash. One of my favorite cat descriptions of a person is Sandy Cat, aka Catherine Martindale in The Clocks. That physical description of her is very much a clue because she ends up being related to someone else in the book, so it's extremely important. Who knew The Clocks would be getting 2 significant mentions on this episode? And then, even if she may not have had a cat of her own, Miss Marple is, of course, herself referred to as a cat quite often. Older women, especially older, nosy, gossipy women, are frequently referred to in Christie as pussies, which is a reference to their feline nature. And yes, this makes some modern readers giggle, maybe especially modern readers in the US. But in our first Miss Marple novel, The Murder at the Vicarage, dear Aunt Jane is described by Griselda as the worst cat in the village and the kind of old cat who is always right. But it's not just Miss Marple who gets the cat treatment, right? As many listeners have mentioned by this point, the cat analogy also extends to Monsieur Poirot. His green eyes, which shine when he's drawing closer to a solution, are distinctly feline. And as Kate Jackson has pointed out, in Murder on the Orient Express, he's described as like a cat pouncing on a mouse. Though, to be fair, we get the exact same description of Elspeth McKay, sister to Superintendent Spence, not Battle, in Halloween Party. She, too, pounces like a cat. And so I would say, in conclusion, while Agatha Christie may not have doted on cats as much as she did on dogs, I think it's pretty clear she has a lot of respect for these resourceful, intriguing, formidable creatures. And that is definitely something worth celebrating on International Cat Day and every day of the year. I hope you enjoyed The Cats of Agatha Christie. I am honestly thrilled that I had that much material to talk about when it comes to cats and Christie. And if there are any cats or even just cat allusions that you love and that you cannot believe I missed, I'd love to hear about it. Please email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. For my next episode, as I mentioned, I am going to be focusing entirely on housekeeping. I am going to be emptying the bulging mailbag of the All About Agatha podcast. I have so many great messages to share with all of you. I'm so excited for that. If you'd like more All About Agatha content, head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. There's a link in the show notes. I've got some great episodes coming up in the next few months. I'll be covering a Mary Westmacott novel, a late 19th century novel by an American author, The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green, which was a big influence on Agatha Christie earlier in her life. I'll also be reviewing the splashy new adaptation of Towards Zero starring Angelica Houston and others. Cannot wait for that. It's already premiered in the UK and it will be coming to us here in the US shortly. So yeah, lots to listen to over on Patreon. Would love for you to join me and all the patrons over there. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And I've got links for the purchase of my second mystery novel, Loose Lips, my first mystery novel, The Busybody, and details on this latest leg of my book tour, which starts in a matter of days. So excited for that. Hope to see some of you out there. Go ahead and give the podcast a rating, a review, whatever you would like, if you haven't already done so. And I'll see you next time. Bye.